The stable doors were open. The wind was moving through them with the particular urgency of a storm that has already made up its mind. And in the lamplight, a girl that half the household couldn't name was standing in the path of the most powerful man in the county. Her hand on the iron latch, her eyes steady, her voice low and certain. "Don't ride tonight, Your Grace." He could have ignored her. Every rule of his world said he should. She was a stable girl. He was a duke. The distance between them was not measured in feet. It was measured in 11 years of a carefully constructed lie. A lie that had destroyed one man's life, erased his name, and left his daughter with nothing but the truth and the patience to wait for the right moment to deliver it. This is the story of what happens when the invisible finally speak, and what it costs everyone in the room when they do. Stay with me, because nothing about this night is what it looks like. The voice came from the shadows between the stable doors, low, steady, and completely out of place. Every groom within earshot froze. No one spoke to the Duke of Ashvere that way. Not the butler who had served 3 generations of his family. Not the estate steward who managed 400 acres with a single ledger. Certainly not a stable girl whose name most of the household had never bothered to learn. And yet there she stood, one hand still resting on the iron latch, her dark eyes fixed on his grace with an expression that was neither fear nor defiance, only certainty. Duke Everett Caldwell had one boot already in the stirrup. He was a man accustomed to obedience, not because he demanded it cruelly, but because the world had always arranged itself around him with quiet efficiency. He turned slowly, more out of curiosity than irritation, and looked at the girl properly for perhaps the first time. She was young, perhaps 20, perhaps a little more, with mud on her boots and straw caught in the braid at her shoulder. There was nothing remarkable about her, except for the fact that she had not yet looked away. "The Eastern Ridge Road is flooded past the crossing, Your Grace," she said, before he could speak. "The water has been rising since midday. The black stallion hasn't been right since yesterday morning, his left foreleg, and there is something else." She paused, and in that pause the wind moved through the stable like a held breath. "Something in the forest that the horses have been afraid of since dusk." Everett studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he removed his boot from the stirrup. What happened next, what was found on that road the following morning, would change everything that anyone in Ashvere thought they understood about that night. But before I tell you what was found on that road the following morning, and what it revealed about the people who knew the Duke's route better than they should have, if you're not yet following this channel, do that now. This is where stories live that stay with you. Now let's go back to the beginning of everything. Sable Maren had arrived at Ashvere Estate 3 years earlier with a single canvas bag and a letter of recommendation so brief it barely filled half a page. The head groom, a thick-necked man named Aldous, had hired her without ceremony because 2 stable hands had left that same week and the horses needed tending regardless of who did the tending. She was given a cot in the room above the tack storage, a set of worn work clothes, and the implicit understanding that her job was to be useful and invisible in equal measure. She had accepted both conditions without complaint. What no one at Ashvere had thought to ask, because servants were rarely asked anything beyond what was immediately useful, was where Sable had come from before that letter. She spoke with the careful diction of someone who had been educated beyond her apparent station, though she never drew attention to it. She read, though she kept her books tucked beneath the cot where they would not provoke questions. She understood horses with an intimacy that went beyond training. She seemed to feel what they felt, to read their silences the way others read faces. Aldous had noticed this, and filed it away as convenient, without wondering what it meant. Among the household staff, Sable existed in that particular loneliness reserved for those who belong fully to neither world. Not coarse enough for the lower servants who drank together on Friday evenings, not acceptable to the upper staff who guarded their proximity to the family, like a privilege earned over decades. She ate alone most mornings. She worked without complaint through weather that sent the other grooms indoors. And every evening, before the stable lamps were extinguished, she would stand at the door of the black stallion's stall and speak to him in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear. That was the whole of her life at Ashvere, or so everyone believed. Isolde Caldwell had been the Duchess of Ashvere for 11 years, and in that time she had refined the management of the estate and of her husband into something that resembled an art form, if art could be cold and precise and invisible. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply arranged things. A word to the housekeeper here, a reassignment there, a social invitation extended or withheld at exactly the right moment. The household ran according to her preferences so completely that most of the staff could not have said, if asked, whether they followed the Duke's authority or the Duchess's will. She was beautiful in the way that certain winter mornings are beautiful, sharp, pale, luminous, and entirely unwelcoming. Those who had known her before her marriage spoke of a warmer woman, but that version of Isolde, if she had ever truly existed, had long since been replaced by this one. Controlled, watchful, and possessed of a memory for slights that bordered on the architectural. She catalogued every small disrespect, every deviation from the order she maintained, and she addressed each one in her own time and in her own way. No one at Ashvere was ever quite sure when they had crossed her, only that they had, and that the consequences would arrive eventually. There was one unwritten rule above all others in the Caldwell household, and every member of the staff understood it without being told. The Duchess's domain was absolute, and anyone who drew the Duke's attention in a way she had not sanctioned was, by definition, a problem. It was not jealousy in any simple sense. Isolde was too disciplined for simple emotions. It was something closer to architecture. She had built this house around a particular set of walls, and she would not tolerate anyone moving them. When the name Sable Maren first reached her ears, spoken by the Duke himself at the breakfast table, with something that sounded almost like appreciation, Isolde set down her teacup with perfect composure and said nothing, which, at Ashvere, was always the most dangerous response. The storm had been building since the previous afternoon, the kind that announces itself in the behavior of animals long before the sky gives any sign. The horses at Ashvere had been restless since midday, shifting in their stalls, refusing water, pressing their heads against the wooden slats with a low, continuous unease that Sable recognized immediately. She had seen this before, in another place, in another life she did not speak about. She increased her rounds, checked each animal twice, and noted with particular concern that Caspian, the black stallion the Duke favored for his evening rides along the eastern ridge, had been favoring his left foreleg since the morning feed. She reported this to Aldous, who looked at the leg, pressed 2 fingers along the tendon, and declared it nothing. He had been declaring things nothing for 30 years, and had the confidence of a man whose errors had never been sufficiently visible to correct him. Sable did not argue. She returned to Caspian's stall after Aldous had gone and spent an hour with the horse in silence, her hand flat against his neck, feeling the tension that ran through him like a current. By late afternoon, 2 of the estate's working horses had refused to eat. The youngest stable hand, a boy of 16 named Percy, asked Sable if she thought something was wrong. She told him to make sure his own work was finished before dark. She did not answer the question directly, because the answer was yes, and she had not yet decided what to do about it. By the time the Duke appeared at the stable doors in his riding coat, the temperature had dropped sharply, and the first thread of wind was moving through the trees at the eastern boundary of the property. Sable had been waiting, not for him specifically, but for the moment she had felt building all day. She knew the Eastern Ridge Road. She knew what flooded water did to limestone crossings in the dark. And she knew that Caspian, with an untreated foreleg and the electric fear of the coming storm running through him, was not a horse that should carry anyone through a forest that had been frightening every animal on the estate since dusk. What was in that forest, she could not say with certainty. But she had learned, long ago, to trust the things that horses knew before people did. The Duke did not ride that night. He returned to the house, sent for the estate physician to examine Caspian's foreleg in the morning, and mentioned the incident at dinner with the mild, appreciative tone of a man recounting something that had surprised him pleasantly. He could not remember the girl's name. He had not thought to ask. But he described her as the dark-haired one from the stables, the one who seemed to actually know what she was doing. It was a small comment, the kind that disappears into the general noise of a dinner conversation, except that Isolde heard it, catalogued it, and did not forget it. She asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, about the girl the following morning. Mrs. Fenwick provided the name, the length of service, and the bare facts of Sable's employment, with the efficiency of a woman who kept precise records of everyone beneath her. Isolde listened without expression and asked one additional question. Had the girl ever had occasion to speak directly to the Duke before? Mrs. Fenwick said she did not believe so. Isolde thanked her and returned to her correspondence. That afternoon, she mentioned to Aldous, in passing, that the Duke preferred his horses prepared by the senior staff and that the newer hands should limit their responsibilities accordingly. Aldous understood. He always understood the Duchess's passages. He told Sable that evening that she would be restricted to the lower paddock and the cart horses until further notice. Sable received this information without visible reaction. She nodded, said she understood, and continued brushing down the mare she had been working with. Only Percy, who was mucking out the adjacent stall and had sharp ears for a 16-year-old, caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the only sign she gave that the demotion had landed. He said nothing. But he remembered it later, when the larger shape of everything became clear, as the detail that told him Sable had understood exactly what was happening from the very first day. She simply chose not to say so. That restraint, that particular quality of composure under pressure, was something Percy would describe to others for years afterward, always with the same mixture of admiration and something close to awe. What the Duchess has just set in motion is only the surface of it, because Isolde doesn't yet know what Sable is actually carrying, and when she finds out, the order she just gave Mrs. Fenwick will look like the smallest mistake she ever made. Keep watching. The real story is just beginning to surface. Everett Caldwell had learned to listen to the invisible people of his household at the age of 12, when a kitchen boy had told him, in a whisper, that the horse his father intended to ride the following morning had been showing signs of colic since dawn. His father had not listened to the kitchen boy, had not even looked at him, and had ridden out regardless. The horse had collapsed 2 miles from the estate. His father had broken 2 ribs and his pride in equal measure, and had spent 3 weeks in bed cursing the animal. Everett had spent those same 3 weeks understanding something that no one in his family had thought to teach him, that the people closest to the ground almost always saw what was coming before anyone else did. It was not a fashionable quality in a duke. His peers managed their estates from a comfortable distance, mediated through layers of stewards and housekeepers and senior staff who filtered the world into something appropriately digestible. Everett had never been comfortable with that distance. He knew the names of his grooms. He knew which tenant farmer's wife had been ill through the winter and which field had been draining poorly for 2 seasons. He did not advertise this knowledge. It would have struck most of his acquaintances as eccentric at best. But it was part of how he understood the world he was responsible for, and he had never seen a reason to stop. When he made quiet inquiries the morning after the stable incident and learned that the dark-haired girl had been reassigned to the cart horses, he felt something shift in him, small but distinct, like a stone turning underfoot. He did not immediately connect it to Isolde. He told himself it was simply an administrative matter, a question of whether the estate's best animal handlers were being used sensibly. He asked the estate steward for Sable's employment record. He read it in his study that evening with a cup of tea that went cold beside him, and when he finished, he sat for a long time, looking at the single line of her letter of recommendation, the line that named the household she had previously served, and felt the small, shifted stone become something considerably larger. They found the fallen oak at first light. It had come down across the Eastern Ridge Road sometime in the early hours, pulled from the saturated ground by the weight of the storm. A tree so old and so massive that it had taken 2 estate workers with axes the better part of the morning to clear enough of it to make the road passable again. The limestone crossing, as Sable had warned, was entirely submerged. The water had risen nearly 4 feet above the ford, fast and dark, and carrying debris from the hills above. A man on horseback, moving at any speed, would have had no warning before the crossing disappeared beneath him. The estate steward made note of it in his weekly report with the dry efficiency of a man who recorded facts without editorializing. Road impassable. Tree removal completed. Crossing to remain closed until water recedes. Estimated 3 days. But Percy, who had been part of the morning crew sent to assess the road, came back with something the steward's report did not include. A description of the crossing itself, of the force of the water moving through it, of the way the current had carved into the bank on the far side. He described it to Sable quietly, when no one else was within hearing. He said that a horse coming down that ridge in the dark, at the Duke's usual pace, would not have been able to stop in time. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply said, "I know," and went back to work. What no one at Ashvere discussed openly, though several people thought it privately, was that the Duke rode the Eastern Ridge Road every Thursday evening without variation. He had done so for years. His route, his timing, and his preferred mount were not secrets within the household. Anyone who paid attention to the rhythms of the estate would have known exactly what road he would take, at what hour, on which horse. Sable had paid attention. And something else, something that would not become clear until much later, suggested that she had not been the only one who had. Everett made his gratitude known the following Sunday. It was not a grand gesture. He was too measured a man for grand gestures. But it was public, which in the economy of a large household amounted to the same thing. He requested that Sable be brought to the front of the stable yard after the morning inspection, and in front of the assembled grooms and 2 members of the upper household staff who happened to be passing, he thanked her directly. He used her name. He said that her judgment had been sound, and her courage in speaking had been noted. He then informed Aldous that she was to be reinstated to her full responsibilities, including the care of Caspian, effective immediately. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Sable received it with the same composure she brought to everything, a slight inclination of her head, a quiet "Thank you, Your Grace," and then she returned to work as if nothing had happened. But the effect on the household was immediate and unmistakable. The other grooms looked at her differently. Mrs. Fenwick mentioned it to the under-housekeeper with an expression that could not quite decide between approval and unease. And Percy, who had been watching from the doorway of the tack room, felt something he could not have named precisely, a sense that the story he was standing inside was considerably larger than he had understood. Isolde was not present in the stable yard. She learned of the exchange from Mrs. Fenwick before luncheon. She listened to the account with her hands folded in her lap and her expression entirely neutral, and when Mrs. Fenwick finished, she said only that it was good that His Grace was satisfied with the staff. Then she excused the housekeeper and sat alone in her sitting room for a long time. The embroidery frame she had been working on remained untouched on the table beside her. She was not the kind of woman who threw things or raised her voice. She was the kind of woman who made decisions, and she had just made one. The order reached Mrs. Fenwick 3 days later, delivered in the Duchess's handwriting on a single folded sheet of her personal stationery. It was brief, specific, and framed, as Isolde always framed such things, as a matter of household efficiency rather than personal preference. The stable girl, Sable Maren, was to be given notice of termination of employment. The reason to be cited was a reduction in seasonal staffing requirements. She was to be given 2 weeks' wages and a reference letter, the content of which the Duchess would draft personally. The matter was to be concluded within the week, before the Duke's return from the tenant inspections in the northern quarter of the estate. Mrs. Fenwick read the letter twice. She had been at Ashvere for 19 years, and had carried out the Duchess's instructions through situations she had learned not to examine too closely. But something about this particular order made her pause in a way she could not entirely explain. Perhaps it was the timing, the calculated use of the Duke's absence. Perhaps it was the instruction about the reference letter, which gave the Duchess editorial control over whatever future Sable might try to build elsewhere. Or perhaps it was simply that Mrs. Fenwick had been watching Sable Maren for 3 years and had quietly formed the opinion that the girl was one of the most capable and honest people in the household. She folded the letter, placed it in her desk drawer, and told herself she would carry out the instruction in the morning. She carried it out that same evening, not because she had overcome her hesitation, but because she had made 19 years of peace with the architecture of her position, and she was not, at her age, prepared to begin dismantling it. She found Sable in the stable, finishing the last of the evening rounds, and delivered the news with as much kindness as the message allowed. She said she was sorry. She meant it. Sable looked at her for a moment, not with anger, and not with the collapse that Mrs. Fenwick had half expected, and then asked, very quietly, if she might have until morning to consider her response. Mrs. Fenwick said yes. She walked back to the house feeling the particular weight of a person who has done something they cannot undo and knows it. Percy found out that night. He had been in the loft above the main stable finishing a repair to the hay pulley that he had been putting off for a week, and he had heard everything through the floorboards. Mrs. Fenwick's carefully modulated voice, Sable's silence, the pauses that were heavier than words. He stayed very still until the housekeeper's footsteps had faded, and then he climbed down and found Sable exactly where he had expected. Standing at Caspian's stall, one hand flat against the horse's neck, not speaking. He asked her what she was going to do. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she crossed to the far corner of the stable, the deep shadow behind the old grain storage where no lamp reached, and she pulled a loose board from the base of the wall with the ease of someone who had done it many times. Behind it was a small space. Inside the space was a wrapped bundle of oilcloth tied with cord. She did not open it. She simply looked at it for a moment, then replaced the board and turned back to Percy with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not quite fear, and not quite resolution, but something that lived in the narrow space between them. "There is only one person in this house who needs to see what's in there," she said. "And it isn't me." Percy was 16 years old and not accustomed to being trusted with things that mattered. He felt the weight of it settle on him like a hand on his shoulder. He asked if she wanted him to do something. She said not yet. She said she needed to think through the order of things carefully, because done wrong, what was in that bundle would change nothing. But done right, it would change everything. Then she sent him to bed. He did not sleep for a very long time, and in the morning, when he came down before the other grooms, he noticed that the oilcloth bundle was gone from behind the board. Sable's cot, when he checked, was still occupied. Whatever she had decided it in the night, alone, in the way she did everything. She said it without self-pity. That was what Mrs. Fenwick remembered afterward. Not the words themselves, but the complete absence of performance in them. Sable had come to the housekeeper's sitting room the following morning, as requested, and when Mrs. Fenwick asked whether she had considered her situation, Sable had simply said it plainly, the way someone states a fact about the weather. She had nowhere to go. No family she could return to. No household that would take her without the reference letter the Duchess intended to write. 2 weeks' wages would carry her perhaps a month in the nearest town, if she was careful. After that, she did not say. She did not need to. Mrs. Fenwick had prepared herself for tears, or for anger, or for the kind of desperate bargaining that sometimes accompanied these conversations. She had not prepared herself for this, for a young woman who sat across from her with her hands folded and her back straight, and communicated the full weight of her precariousness without asking for a single thing. It was, Mrs. Fenwick thought, one of the most quietly devastating things she had ever witnessed in 19 years of managing other people's difficult moments. She offered Sable tea. Sable accepted it. They sat together for a moment in a silence that felt, strangely, more honest than most conversations Mrs. Fenwick had in a week. "I would like to speak to the Duke," Sable said, when she had finished the tea. "Not to contest the dismissal, not to cause any difficulty for anyone in this house. There is something he needs to know, something that has nothing to do with me or my position here, and I am not able to leave with a clear conscience until I have found a way to tell him." Mrs. Fenwick looked at her for a long time. The request was irregular. The Duchess would not approve. The timing, with the Duke still away on his tenant inspections, made it logistically complicated in any case. All of this passed through Mrs. Fenwick's mind in the space of a few seconds. Then she said she would see what could be arranged. She did not tell the Duchess. For the first time in 19 years, she made that choice deliberately. Isolde had known who Sable Maren was from the moment Mrs. Fenwick had given her the name. Not Sable specifically. She had never met the girl directly, but the name Maren was not unfamiliar to her. It belonged to a family she had gone to considerable lengths, 11 years ago, to ensure remained invisible. The connection was not simple, and it was not something she could explain to anyone without unraveling a version of her own history that she had spent more than a decade carefully rewriting. So she had done what she always did with inconvenient truths. She had buried it beneath layers of composure and action, and she had moved to eliminate the problem before it could speak. What Isolde knew, what she had known since the morning after the Duke's public gratitude in the stable yard, was that Sable Maren was the daughter of a man named Corwin Maren, and Corwin Maren had once been the closest friend, the most trusted confidant, and ultimately the most significant casualty of a decision Everett's father had made in the last year of his life. A decision that Isolde, then newly married and already expert at the architecture of influence, had helped engineer. Corwin Maren had been accused of falsifying estate accounts. He had been dismissed without reference, without recourse, and without the opportunity to present evidence that might have cleared his name. He had died 3 years later, in reduced circumstances, leaving behind a daughter who had been 12 years old at the time, and who had, apparently, spent the intervening years getting herself close enough to the truth to matter. Whether Sable knew the full shape of what had happened to her father, Isolde could not be certain. But the bundle of papers she had noticed the girl retrieving from the stables, spotted by a housemaid who reported to Isolde as a matter of long-standing arrangement, suggested that Sable had more than suspicion. She had documentation, which meant that the dismissal was no longer simply a matter of household management. It was a matter of survival. Isolde sat at her writing desk that evening and composed 2 letters. One was the reference letter for Sable, carefully worded to ensure no reputable household would take her. The other was to a solicitor in London, a man who had helped her with delicate matters before, framed as a routine legal inquiry, worded in the way that only Isolde could word things, meaning everything and saying nothing. Everett returned from the northern tenant inspections on the 4th day, a day earlier than expected, because the weather had cleared faster than anticipated, and because he had found himself on the 2nd evening unable to stop thinking about the employment record he had read in his study before leaving. The single line of Sable's letter of recommendation, the name of the household she had previously served. He had turned it over in his mind for 2 days without being able to fully articulate why it disturbed him, and he had finally decided that the only way to stop turning it over was to come home and look more carefully at what he actually knew. He found the household in the particular state of controlled tension that he had learned, over 11 years, to recognize as Isolde's fingerprints. Everything was in order. Everything was too much in order. He asked Mrs. Fenwick for the weekly staff report with the casualness of a man making routine inquiries, and Mrs. Fenwick, who had spent 4 days quietly reconsidering the architecture of her own loyalties, handed it to him without redacting anything. The notice of termination for Sable Maren was on the 3rd page, dated 2 days after his departure, cited as seasonal staffing reduction. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set the report down on the hall table and stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He did not go to Isolde immediately. He had learned, over 11 years, that confronting her before he understood the full shape of a situation was an error. She was too skilled at redirection, too expert at offering him a partial truth that satisfied the surface of his concern while leaving the deeper architecture untouched. Instead, he went to the stables, where he found Percy doing the evening rounds alone. He asked the boy, with a directness that clearly startled him, where Sable was and whether she had left the estate yet. Percy said she had not, that she was in the upper paddock, finishing the late feed. Then Percy hesitated, in the way of someone deciding whether to say something they've been holding. Everett waited. He was good at waiting, and Percy told him about the bundle behind the board, about the night Sable had moved it, and about the one thing she had said that Percy had not been able to stop thinking about since, that there was only one person in the house who needed to see what was inside it, and it wasn't her. The Duke now has the documents. He knows what was done, and he knows who did it. But there is still one conversation that hasn't happened yet. The one that Isolde has been trying to prevent from the very first morning she heard Sable's name. That conversation is coming. And when it does, 11 years of carefully constructed walls are going to come down in a single evening. Isolde found Sable first. She had not intended to, or rather, she had intended it in the way she intended everything. Precisely, privately, and at a moment of her own choosing. She intercepted her in the corridor outside the linen storage on the morning of the 5th day, when the house was in that particular mid-morning quiet that meant most of the staff were occupied elsewhere. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten explicitly. She simply stood in Sable's path and looked at her with the full weight of 11 years of practiced authority, and said that she understood Sable had requested a meeting with the Duke. Sable looked back at her without flinching. That was the detail that Isolde had not fully prepared for. Not the girl's composure exactly, but the specific quality of it. It was not the composure of someone performing bravery. It was the composure of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time and had already lived through it in her mind so many times that the reality of it held no new terror. Sable said yes. She had made the request. She said it quietly, without aggression, and without any of the deference that Isolde's position would normally have commanded. The air between them was very still. "Whatever you believe you know," Isolde said, "you should consider very carefully what it would cost you to say it." It was the closest she had ever come, in 11 years, to showing her hand directly. Sable was silent for a moment. Then she said, with the same quiet certainty she had used in the stable doorway 5 days ago, "I already have, Your Grace. I've been considering it for 8 years. She stepped to the side, with perfect courtesy, and continued down the corridor. Isolde stood alone in the passage and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular cold of a situation she could not arrange her way out of. She had 11 years of walls, and Sable Maren had just walked through one of them as if it were made of air. Everett found Sable in the upper paddock, as Percy had said. He had not gone to her the previous evening, though he had known where she was. He had spent the night at his desk instead, rereading the employment record, tracing the name of the household she had previously served through 3 years of his own memory, making certain that what he suspected was not something he was constructing from the pressure of wanting an explanation. He was not a man who acted on suspicion. He waited until morning, until the light was clear and his thinking was equally so. And then he crossed the paddock with the deliberate step of someone who has decided what he owes and is prepared to pay it. She saw him coming and did not move away, which told him something. She had the oilcloth bundle with her. She had been carrying it, he realized, since the night Mrs. Fenwick had delivered the notice, keeping it close in the way of someone who has learned not to leave important things unattended. She held it out to him before he had fully crossed the paddock. Inside were documents. Not many, 8 pages in total, some handwritten, some printed, all aged in the particular way of papers that have been carefully preserved rather than simply kept. The first was a letter in his father's handwriting, a handwriting Everett would have known anywhere, dated 11 years ago, addressed to Corwin Maren. It acknowledged a discrepancy in the estate accounts and stated clearly in his father's own hand that the error had originated with the estate's external auditor and that Maren bore no responsibility for it. It was a letter of complete exoneration, written privately, never sent. The second document was the formal record of Maren's dismissal, signed by the estate steward of the time, and countersigned in a hand Everett recognized with a coldness that moved through him from his chest to his fingertips, by someone who had not held an official role in the estate management, but who had apparently been present at the proceeding regardless. The counter-signature was Isolde's. He stood in the paddock for a long time with the papers in his hands, while Caspian moved quietly in the grass behind him, and the afternoon light fell across the pages at an angle that made his father's handwriting very clear and very final. Sable said nothing. She had said what needed to be said by handing him the documents, and she understood in the way she seemed to understand most things, that what he needed now was not more information, but time. She waited at a respectful distance, her hands quiet at her sides, while the Duke of Ashvere read the proof that his father had been manipulated in the last year of his life, that an innocent man had been destroyed to keep a secret contained, and that the woman who had engineered it had been sitting across from him at the breakfast table for 11 years. When he finally looked up, his face was composed in the way of someone who has just understood something enormous and has not yet decided what to do with it. He folded the papers carefully. He put them inside his coat, and he walked back toward the house without speaking. But not before he turned, once, and told Sable, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, that she was not to leave the estate. He did not go to her immediately. He spent an hour in his study with the documents spread across the desk, reading each page a second time with the particular attention of a man who wants to be absolutely certain before he acts. He sent for the estate steward, not the current one, but the records archive that the current steward maintained, and cross-referenced 3 years of account ledgers against the dismissal record with a methodical patience that surprised even himself. Everything aligned. Every figure confirmed what the documents said. Sable Maren had not falsified anything. He had been the person most likely to discover who had. Among the papers on Isolde's writing desk, which Everett reviewed that same evening with the careful attention of a man who has decided to understand the full extent of what he is dealing with, he found the draft of a letter addressed to a solicitor in London. It was framed, in Isolde's characteristic way, as a routine legal inquiry. The meaning beneath the framing was not routine at all. He set it aside with the other documents. The solicitor in London never received a completed instruction. The matter ended there on the writing desk, in the particular silence of something that was intended to cause harm, and did not. He found Isolde in the drawing room before dinner. She was dressed for the evening, composed in the way she was always composed, and she looked up when he entered with the practiced expression of a wife welcoming her husband back into a room. He closed the door behind him. He did not sit. He placed the documents on the table between them without a word and watched her look at them. Watched the precise moment when her eyes registered what they were, and the composure shifted, not into fear exactly, but into something that sat just beneath it, like ice that has begun to thin. It was the first genuinely unguarded expression he had seen on her face in 11 years, and it lasted only a second before the architecture reassembled itself. But he had seen it, and they both knew he had seen it. What followed was not a scene in the way that scenes at Ashvere were usually contained. Low voices, careful language, the civilized management of difficulty. Isolde had spent 11 years behind those walls, and when she felt them giving way, she did something she had never done in front of him before. She lost the precise distance she kept between herself and her own actions. She did not confess. She was too trained for confession. But she argued, and in arguing she revealed. She said that Sable Maren had been a threat to the stability of the estate. She said that the late Duke had been too sentimental to act decisively. She said that what she had done had protected Everett's inheritance, his reputation, his future. As if the destruction of an innocent man were a form of housekeeping, as if it could be filed under management of difficult circumstances and forgotten. The words came out with the pressure of 11 years behind them, and when they were done, the room was very quiet, and Isolde was standing with her hands at her sides and the full shape of what she was completely visible for the first time. 3 members of the household staff, passing in the corridor outside the drawing-room door, heard enough to understand the shape of it, if not every word. By morning, the household would know. and by the following day, so would the county. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study until the fire burned down to ash, and the first gray light began at the edges of the curtains. And he thought with the same methodical patience he had brought to the documents. Not about what he felt, because what he felt was too large and too complicated to be useful, but about what he owed. He owed Corwin Maren's memory a public correction. He owed Sable, who had carried those documents for 8 years and had brought them to him at the cost of her own position, something he could not yet fully name but recognized as a debt of considerable weight. He owed the estate, the tenants, the staff, the people whose lives ran alongside his, a version of leadership that did not look away from what had been done in its name. What he chose was not revenge. He was too deliberate a man for revenge, and too aware of its costs. What he chose was accountability, a word that sounds simple and is, in practice, one of the most difficult things a person of his position could elect. He wrote 3 letters before dawn. The first was to the family solicitor, instructing him to formally restore Corwin Maren's reputation in the estate records, to document the exoneration his father had written and never sent, and to ensure that the correction was entered into the county registry, where the original dismissal had been recorded. The second was to a colleague who sat on the local magistrate's bench, a careful letter, factual and precise, that laid out what the documents showed and asked for guidance on the appropriate course of action regarding the countersignature. The third letter he did not send immediately. He set it aside until morning, when he would know better what it needed to say. He had chosen, 11 years ago, to trust the architecture Isolde had built around their life together. He understood now that this had not been love's blindness exactly. It had been the particular failure of a person who prefers order to scrutiny, who mistakes the absence of visible problems for the presence of genuine peace. He did not excuse himself for it. He simply added it to what he owed, and carried it with the same composure he asked of everyone around him. When Percy came to light the study fire at 6 in the morning and found the Duke already awake at his desk, he asked without thinking if his Grace had slept. Everett looked at him with the expression of someone who has traveled a great distance in a single night, and said quietly that he had not, but that he knew what needed to be done, which was better than sleep. Among the things he knew needed doing was a quiet reorganization of the stable hierarchy. Aldous was reassigned before the week was out, not dismissed, because Everett was not a man who punished people for following the orders of those above them, but moved to the outer farmyards where his 30 years of confident declarations would do considerably less damage. He was told it was a restructuring. He accepted it with the dignity of a man who suspects the real reason and has decided not to ask. She left on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after Mrs. Fenwick had delivered the notice. Not because the dismissal still stood. It did not. Everett had formally rescinded it the morning after the drawing-room confrontation, through Mrs. Fenwick, with a written note that restored her position and her full standing in the household. She left because she had decided to, in the quiet way she decided everything. After sitting with the question for several days and arriving at the answer she had perhaps always known was waiting. She said goodbye to Percy first, which was right, because he had been the one person in the household who had seen her clearly from the beginning without requiring anything from her in return. She gave him the books from under her cot, 3 of them, worn at the spines and annotated in her careful handwriting in the margins. He protested that they were hers. She said she had read them enough times to carry them without the pages. He did not have a response to that, and so he accepted them, and stood in the stable doorway watching her finish the last of her packing with the particular helplessness of someone watching something inevitable that they have not made peace with. She told him he was going to be a very good horseman. She said it the way she said most things, without ornamentation, and therefore with the full weight of what she meant. She left one thing behind, and it was not an accident. On the small shelf above Caspian's stall, where the grooming kit was kept, and where a strip of morning light fell through a gap in the planking at exactly the right angle, she placed a single folded note, unsealed. It was addressed to no one. Percy found it an hour after she had gone and brought it to the Duke without reading it, because he understood, somehow, that it was not for him. Everett opened it in the stable, standing in the same spot where Sable had stood 8 days ago with her hand on the latch and her dark eyes steady. Inside were 4 words, written in her clear, careful hand. You always rode well. Nothing else. No signature. No request. No claim. Just 4 words that managed, in the way of the very best things, to say everything they needed to say, and nothing they did not. Isolde did not leave Ashvere immediately. She had nowhere to go in the same way that Sable had nowhere to go, except that Isolde's version of nowhere was furnished with social connections and financial resources and the kind of reputation that takes years to erode. Even after a drawing-room confrontation that half the county household network had heard about within a week. She remained at Ashvere through the formal legal process that Everett's letter to the magistrate had initiated, not because she was required to, but because leaving would have confirmed everything, and confirmation was the one thing she had spent 11 years avoiding. What changed was not sudden. It was the slow, grinding work of a person who has built an entire self on the premise that control is the same thing as safety, and who is forced, by the removal of every wall she has constructed, to sit alone in a room with what is actually true. She had not thought of Corwin Maren as a man in many years. She had thought of him as a problem that had been solved, a variable that had been eliminated, a risk that had been managed. Sitting in her room on the 3rd night after the drawing room, in the particular silence that follows a collapse of structure, she found that he had become a man again, a person with a daughter who had carried his story for 8 years through every indignity the world had offered her, with a composure and a grace that Isolde recognized, sitting alone in the dark, as everything she herself had never been. That recognition did not absolve her. She was too honest, in the privacy of her own mind, to allow it to function as absolution. But it was the first true thing she had felt in a very long time, and she did not look away from it. There was one other consequence that no one announced formally, because it required no announcement. The housemaid who had reported Sable's movements to the Duchess, a long-standing arrangement that several members of the staff had suspected and none had named, found, in the days following the drawing-room confrontation, that the particular currency of her position had simply ceased to exist. The network of small loyalties that Isolde had cultivated over 11 years did not collapse dramatically. It dissolved, the way frost dissolves when the temperature changes, gradually, without ceremony, and without anyone needing to say out loud what everyone already understood. The housemaid requested a transfer to a cousin's household in the next county before the month was out. Mrs. Fenwick processed the paperwork without comment. Some departures, she had learned, are their own kind of confession. She asked to meet with the estate solicitor voluntarily without being summoned on the 6th day. She provided a written account of her role in the Maren dismissal, not comprehensive because comprehensive was still beyond her, but specific enough to corroborate the documents and spare the legal process the cost of reconstruction. Everett was informed of this by the solicitor and received the information without visible reaction. He did not thank her for it. He did not need to, and she did not expect him to. What had existed between them for 11 years had not been love in any form that either of them could defend under honest examination. It had been a structure, and structures, when their foundations are removed, do not become something else. They simply end. The separation that followed was handled by the family solicitor with the same quiet efficiency that had always characterized Ashvere's management of difficult things. Isolde left in early autumn in a carriage that she had arranged herself without ceremony. Mrs. Fenwick watched from the upper window and felt the particular complicated grief of someone who has served a complicated person for a very long time. The morning after Isolde's departure, Everett went to the stables before breakfast. It was something he had not done in years. Come to the stables at first light, before the household was properly awake, in the early quiet, when the horses moved softly in their stalls, and the smell of hay and leather and cold morning air was the whole of the world. He stood at Caspian's stall for a long time, one hand against the horse's neck in the gesture he had watched Sable use so many times without understanding, until now, what it was for. It was not comfort exactly. It was presence, the simple, honest act of being with something living and letting that be enough. He had written the third letter the morning after the drawing-room confrontation and set it aside for 8 days, reading it again each morning to see if it still said what he meant. On the 9th morning, the morning after Isolde left, he read it a final time and decided that it did. He gave it to Percy to deliver, with instructions that the boy was to travel to the nearest town and make inquiries at the 3 most reputable boarding houses until he found where Sable Maren was staying. Percy left before 8 and returned before noon, with the confirmation that the letter had been placed in Sable's hands directly, and that she had read it in front of him without expression, and then asked him, very quietly, if he had eaten. He said he had not. She had fed him before sending him back. Percy reported this last detail with a grin that he could not entirely suppress, and Everett felt something move in his chest that was not complicated at all. Something very simple that he had not felt in a very long time. The letter had not been a declaration. He was too honest a man, and she was too honest a woman, for declarations that outpaced what was actually known. It had been, instead, an accounting. A clear and careful statement of what he understood, what he had set in motion to correct it, and what he believed she deserved to know about the formal restoration of her father's name in the estate and county records. At the end, in the last paragraph, he had written that Ashvere had a position for a head of stables that had needed filling for 2 years, and that no candidate had yet satisfied the requirements. He had written that the requirements were not complicated. Sound judgment, genuine knowledge, and the particular courage of someone who speaks the truth to power when it would be far easier to stay silent. He had written that if she was ever inclined to return, the position would remain open. That the door, the same stable door where she had stood with her hand on the latch and stopped him from riding into the dark, would be unlocked. And that he had learned, perhaps later than he should have, that the people closest to the ground almost always see what is coming before anyone else does. Some of them, if you are very fortunate, will tell you, and some of them, if you are more fortunate still, will stay. Because the world does not reward the loudest voice in the room. It rewards the ones who, in the cold and the dark and the silence, never stopped telling the truth. Sable never asked for justice. She asked for nothing, actually. She simply carried the truth until someone was ready to receive it. And that quiet, patient kind of courage is rarer than any title or any estate. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to hold on to a truth for a long time, waiting for the right moment or the right person to finally be able to say it? I read every single comment, and I'll see you in the next story.